Hello, everyone, and welcome to History and Games, a podcast that celebrates the educational power of video games by talking about the real stories and history hidden inside our favorite games. Now, in the last episode, I talked about a very fun mob simulator called Ochlos that's developed by Coffee Powered Machine and published by Digital Devolver. It's an extremely fun, silly game in which you, an ancient Greek philosopher, whip up the hoi polloi, the masses of ancient Greece, and go on a rampage against oppressive, mean-spirited Olympian gods. It's very silly, very fun. It's on Steam right now. If you guys want to check it out, I highly recommend it. It's something different for ancient Greece. Most games about ancient Greece are about like strategy games like Civ 6 or action games like God of War, but this is something new and different. And what's unique about this game is it sort of involuntarily follows the narrative arc of how ancient democracy came to be between 514 and 508 BCE. The masses got real tired of the aristocrats and their endless squabbles and bringing in foreign troops to occupy Athens. They completely blew up. And that was actually the catalyst for what would later become demos, people, kratos, power. So that is a huge concept, though, right? The idea of democracy. How do we define it? How has it evolved over time? And how the heck has it survived considering the state of things? Well, I decided to bring in an expert because that's out of my wheelhouse. So I'd like to welcome to the show Professor Josiah Ober from the University of Stanford, who is the expert not only on the theory of democracy, but also ancient democracy. He has several impressive books out about the subject, including Democracy and Knowledge, Innovation and Learning in Classical Athens, Demopolis, Democracy Before Liberalism in Theory and Practice, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens, Intellectual Critics of Popular Rule, and I'm very excited about this one, the upcoming book, Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives. Welcome, Professor Ober. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Meg. I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about this to your audience.
Yes, I really feel the timing of this interview is particularly interesting because over the weekend, while I was putting together this interview, while I was taking notes, I had the news on in the background. And it's very interesting, the state of democracy right now. And I'll explain what I mean by this. It's hard not to feel like it's a little bit on fire, where you've got protests going on in Israel. We're very polarized in the United States when it comes to our political beliefs. You've got democracies around the world that aren't acting very democratic. And so I was hoping by talking to you and defining democracy, how it came to be, how it evolved, how it survived over time, we can answer a pretty profound question. And that question is democracy in danger? Should we be a little bit afraid, or by looking at the past, we can feel a little bit assured? I know that's a big, profound question, but that's exactly why I have you on today to sort of talk about these things.
Oh, absolutely. I think that that's as important a question as we can ask today. I mean, there are so many issues that are confronting us now: climate change, generational transfers. But if we don't get the democracy question right, we're not going to be able to solve any of these other questions. So I think you actually hit it on the head. And indeed, I think there is real danger. Is democracy in terrible crisis? Is democracy about to die? I don't think so. But unless we do something, it will enter a period of real crisis, and then the death of democracy becomes a real possibility. So it's really up to us, and that's why I think talking about this, thinking about how games can, in some ways, help us to educate ourselves as citizens, help us think about what the potential is. For the kind of things we can do together to keep the system alive, the system that I think it really is fundamentally necessary for answering all of the other big questions that are confronting us today.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. I'm going to turn up my microphone so people can hear me a little bit better. I don't know why it turned itself down, because this is an important discussion. And so I kind of wanted to start with idea of how to define democracy. It's kind of right there in the Greek name, which is, the first part is demos, people, and then kratos, or video game fans will know this name, Kratos, power, right? And so it's really sort of harkens back as far back in terms of Western democracy as ancient Athens, and the idea of how it came about, how people power completely flipped the status quo upside down, and gave us this idea that together we can accomplish quite a bit. So I thought we would start off by sort of walking through the events that led up to people power, and then talk about, the definition of it, and how it survived.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think that the core definition that we get from antiquity about what people power really is a rejection of a boss. Democracy really at its core means no boss. And if we're not going to have a boss, what does that mean? It means that we have to run things ourselves. That is, we have to be our own boss collectively, and that's people power. That is, the capacity of us as a body of citizens to do something together that's really impactful, that really changes the world. So if we go back to Athens and we find ourselves in the middle of the 6th century BC, Athens was at that time run by a boss, by a guy named Pisistratus, who was known in later history as the tyrant of Athens. Tyrant, the Greek word tyrannos, originally didn't mean, a nasty dictator who does evil things all the time. Pisistratus was regarded as a pretty good boss, but he died. His sons then took over, and some of the Athenians began to feel that this is not so great. We now have a family that's passing on power from father to son. Where is it all going to end? Well, there was a plot against the family of the tyrant that ends up in the killing of one of the two sons of Pisistratus. And after that, the existing son decided, I'm going to take this tyrant thing seriously. In other words, it's time to put the boot on the neck of the Athenian people. Well, that caused even worse problems. Ultimately, the rival state of Sparta was called in by a group of Athenian aristocrats, and they said, "Why don't you, get rid of this tyrant, and then maybe put one of us in charge?" So the Spartans came in. They effectively kicked out the last of the tyrant family, went home again, hoping then that a aristocrat favorable to Sparta would take over. That didn't happen, at least it didn't happen right away, because another one of the Athenian aristocrats who'd been really involved in sort of anti-tyranny activities took this radical step. He was getting sort of beaten out in the power game. He took this radical step, according to the historian Herodotus, that he brought the people into his coalition. Now, what did that mean? It basically means he came up with a plan that would be a whole new idea about how Athens might be run, that would give real power to the people. Of course, the other rival aristocrat didn't like that. And so what did he do? He sent back to Sparta and said, this is not working out. This is not how we thought it was going to happen. This guy, Cleisthenes, has made an alliance with the mob, the ordinary people of Athens. It's an absolute catastrophe. So the leader of Sparta then says, don't worry about it. I will send a crack army, some Spartans, some mercenaries. They'll be there in a few days. In the meantime, I'm going to send an order that anybody who is allied with Cleisthenes, this rabble rouser, better get out of Athens now. So Herodotus tells us Cleisthenes takes the message, he leaves, and his closest supporters, the other aristocrats that are allied with him, they don't want to die. The Spartans are really pretty mean guys, so they all leave. The Spartans arrive in Athens, and say, well, now the pro-Spartan aristocrat, a guy named Isagoras, is going to be running things not as a tyrant. No, we Spartans don't like tyrants. But he's going to bring in 300 of his specially chosen supporters, and they'll run things. We'll have a nice, tight oligarchy, a nice, tight pro-Spartan oligarchy there. All done. They went to the existing council that had been established by Cleisthenes and his supporters, at least the ones that were still there, and then said, gentlemen, it's time for you to disband, and you're not needed anymore. Your service isn't necessary. We have 300 new councilmen who will be running the show now. At this moment, then, Herodotus tells us the council resisted and refused to obey. And here's the key thing: the people of Athens, being of one mind, being allied, cooperating together, besieged the Spartans on the Acropolis. The Spartans saw this uprising. They ran up to the Acropolis, a natural fortress in the middle of Athens, as before all the pretty temples were built up there. It's basically a fortress area. But they were besieged then for 3 days. They surrendered, and because they ran out of food and water, they weren't expecting to be besieged. And at that point, the Spartans were kicked out. Go home now. The people of Athens called back Cleisthenes and his closest supporters, and they said, "Okay, deliver." You promised there was going to be this new cool form. What's the big idea? And at that point, Cleisthenes has to deliver a plan which turned out to be very effective, that creates the basic institutions that then are the institutions of democracy, of real people power. But the important thing about the story is that, yes, there was a leader, a guy who had a plan, but he wasn't the one who delivered the Athens, the revolutionary moment. It was the people themselves. And I think that's one of the tensions and excitements that the Aklos Omega game really brings to the fore.
Right. And so let's deep dive a little bit about the reforms that Cleisthenes, sorry, I say it completely differently. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but like he comes up with these ideas. And one of the things that strikes me about these ideas is how he enfranchises a lot of people who are on the edges of villages and towns around Athens, how he brings them in and divides the system. So instead of having just 4 basic tribes in Athens, now you have 10, and those 10 tribes can be divided into a larger army. And in a very timely way, this army being put together that way manages to defend these new rights, because King Cleomenes of Sparta, the one who came in with his 300 soldiers and was like, everybody out, we're doing this the Spartan way, he gets totally surprised. He has to shame walk his way home after the people rise up against him, right? But he's not finished with Athens, is he? That's not the end of the story. That's he has to get a thorough thumping before he gets the message. And I think what's interesting about that is how the people came together. Can you talk a little bit about like what happened that sort of solidified in the minds of people that, hey, not only did we rise up and kick this guy out, but we just defeated a bunch of enemies on all sides?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the exciting moment of the revolution, you kicked out this small Spartan army that they thought that would be adequate to take care of the problem. Yeah, now what? The Spartans are very angry. They're coming back pretty soon. You've got a year or two before they rally their allies. So you've got to have a system that quickly creates sort of a new sense of belonging among the Athenian, really very extended Athenian population. So now for the first time, basically all free males in Athens are going to be citizens. So that's totally new idea. The idea that we're going to have a really large population is going to be engaged in politics as opposed to being, simply told what to do. But how's that going to work? Athens was a very small place by modern nation-state standards, but very large by ancient city-state standards, with a population of maybe 30,000 free males. How are you going to get people who live in very different parts of the Athenian territory, in the city area, in the coastal area, engaged in trade and fishing and so on, in the agricultural interior? How are you going to get them to actually coordinate and work together on long-term projects like keeping the Spartans out and rebuilding the economy? So what the brilliant idea that the Cleisthenes has is that what you've got to do is to mix the citizens together. You've got to get it so men of the coast and of the inland and of the urban area all see each other truly as fellow Athenians and are capable of working together. So as you exactly rightly said, he says, we're not going to worry about these 4 old ancestral tribes. We're going to have 10 new tribes, completely artificial. We're just going to make these things up. When we say tribe, we sort of imagine, this goes back to distant antiquity. No, these are going to be completely new and fresh. And each one of the tribes, 1/10 of the Athenian population, will be drawn from each of the 3 primary zones: the coast, the city, and the agricultural inland, so that now your tribe members will not just be people that are doing the same things in their daily life as you. They're not people that you've met probably, because this is a society in which people are pretty insular up to that point. You're now going to be dealing with, as your fellow tribe members, people who have very different lives than yourselves. What are you going to do with them? In the first instance, you're going to fight alongside them because the Athenian army will now be structured as an army of tribes. So each of the tribes are going to have to put together a battalion, and there'll be urban guys and coastal guys and city guys in each battalion. And the political organization of the new council will be likewise organized by tribes. A lot of the religious life of the city will be organized by tribes. So you'll be living with, in various ways, very important parts of your life, people that are from very different parts of Athens. It works. The Spartans do, in fact, raise, as you say, a new army. They gathered allies to the north and to the east of Athens, as well as coming up with their main force from the south. And they've got this huge sort of multiple pincher movement coming forward, and the Spartans are very sure, this time we get revenge, and this time we get rid of that whole crazy democracy idea. It's all gone. What do they meet when they bring their army forward? They figure they're going to meet, a few hundred aristocrats in their fancy armor and so on. I mean, the usual thing from the olden time, the way it usually used to work. The armies were small, and they were basically, guys who could afford fancy armor and so on. What do they find? more or less 30,000 Athenians. Probably most of them with sharpened pikes and so on, but whoa, this is not what we had expected. Very quickly, some of Sparta's key allies decide, actually, there's been a mistake in the strategy. We need to go home to rethink things. And then Sparta say, oh, whoa, without our key allies, we'd better go home ourselves. The Athenians mop up the rest of the allies from the north and the east. You have this really dramatic victory. And go on then to have the space to really instantiate, to really put in place the full workings of their new democratic system.
Right. So now they have the actual experience of working side by side on the battlefield. Everything else must be pretty easy. If you can survive that together, then, civil discourse, must be a little bit easier, or maybe not, because you mentioned in your upcoming book about, the civic bargain, that for a democracy to come together and really survive, there are, I think, 7 conditions that have to be met. And so after the spectacular victory, it takes a few more decades to get to actual democracy. There's some sort of stepping stones along the way, where the Persian Wars, which brings Athens together even more. And you've got brilliant men like Themistocles, who democratize the city-state even more by, building a navy. And anyone can row, right? Row a ship. And so now people have real civic pride. Now everyone from the top to the bottom can defend their city-state. But even then, it takes until about 460s BCE before a man named Alphiades comes along, and he breaks the last sort of like the Supreme Court of ancient Athens, which still has a stranglehold on all the other, civic bodies. And then you have Pericles, who is both very democratic inside Athens, maybe not so much outside of Athens. So how does that come about? How does democracy take that sort of, I don't know if I want to say final form, because it's always evolving, but how does it take that necessary, crucial step to become democracy, a direct democracy as sort of we understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing about a democracy is that indeed it does require certain conditions to be stable over time. You can get an exciting moment of revolution. Okay, we're all together. Maybe there's the second moment of, oh, the Spartans are coming. Yes, we can stop them if we've got this idea of belonging, fighting together. But you need to really institutionalize things if you're going to keep it going in the long run. So if we start out by saying that democracy is no boss, then you've got to say, well, what are the conditions to keep this no boss? In the first instance, what you've got to have is that at least we have the capacity to maintain baseline security, keep the Spartans at bay, and baseline welfare, like we're not all starving all the time. Okay, so if we can't do security and welfare, this democracy thing is not going to work out. So we've got to find a way to make sure that at least we're competitive in terms of the other rival states that are around us. We have to at least be as secure and as prosperous as they are. So that's like the first condition. And so you're going to have the design is going to have have that. And then we're going to have to decide also who really is one of us. Now, who is a citizen? To the Cleisthenes moment, all right, all adult free males who are living within Athenian territory are citizens. But then how are we going to make new citizens after, okay, we had the revolutionary moment, but how do we, so you're going to have to decide on that. And then you're going to have to decide on some of the, how do we make decisions? How do we then together, as we the Athenians, make decisions rather than just waiting for some leader to tell us what to do? So you're going to have a council, and you're going to have a court system, and you're going to have an assembly of the citizens that is capable of actually making decisions. And then I think really essentially, and all of this really is at the heart of the Athenian story, they're going to have the capacity to make bargains. You're going to have some people who are richer than others. Some people have different interests. Once again, the coast people, the urban people, the inland people. You're going to have to develop a habit of recognizing that when you go into the assembly, as a citizen, you're going to have a vote like everybody else. And you're going to have some things that you really want to have, I want that delivered. I want that policy. I want us to do this. But you have to recognize that there are other people in the assembly with a vote who want something somewhat different. So, okay, we all agree we want security and we want welfare. Yes, but exactly what are the policies that we're going to enact? And the key thing is we're going to enact policies by cutting deals with one another. Nobody's going to get all they want. The rich people might say, well, the important thing is that we don't have a high taxation rate. The poorer people might say, well, the important thing is that we have some basic, welfare guarantees about for orphans of war orphans and so on and so forth. That's going to actually take some tax money. So you're going to have to find a way then, if you're not going to fall into civil conflict, to actually make bargains. And I think that's really at the core of the problem of democracy in many ways today, is we've kind of forgotten that democracy is about bargaining, not getting everything you want. Things don't work out just exactly the way any group wants, but the bargain is better for everybody than not being in the bargain. So we tend to think, I think, often about politics today as like win-lose, right? It's zero sum. One side wins, one side loses. I mean, there are some games that are structured that way, right? There are winners and there are losers, but there are other games, and I think the game of democracy means that we've got to figure out ways to cooperate so that everybody does better than they would if we weren't cooperating, even if nobody gets everything that they want. It's basically a matter of finding ways to create long-term cooperation. And that's what the Athenians do. That's what happens in the generation after these exciting revolutionary events at the end of the 6th century, is they develop a more complex forms of social cooperation, more complex forms of institutional arrangements, and they developed the idea that we don't all have to get together with 30,000 of us with sharpened sticks. It would be more efficient to have, an army and a navy, because the navy is going to allow us to project power and to defend against seaborne threats like from the Persians. So that's really at the heart of it, is that the Athenians figure out both a culture and institutions that enable cooperation through basically ongoing bargaining. Everybody gets more than they would if they hadn't entered into the bargain, but nobody gets exactly what they want.
Right. So it's kind of a balancing act of, trying to find that middle ground where it's like, you want one thing, I want the opposite. We've got to meet in the middle, come to a consensus about how we get a little bit of what we want. And even if we don't get everything we want, there feels like everyone leaves sort of satisfied. You at least got something in this bargain.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's in simple model. I mean, it's like when you go to buy something in a store, right? Well, your best outcome may be that you get the thing you want and you don't give any money at all for it. And the owner of the stores, maybe their best thing is, well, I get your money, but I don't have to give you anything for it. Well, you both know that's not going to happen, unless you're a thief or the store owner's a thief. So what do? You go in and you basically strike a bargain, right? You say, well, yes, the thing I want is worth this much, money, and I'm better off having the thing and giving the shop owner the money, and the shop owner is better off giving you the thing and taking the money. It's a bargain, and you're both better off in the bargain than not in the bargain, because that you want the thing, and he wants your money, and there you have it. So I think thinking about politics in that sort of sense, that we're actually cutting a deal in which we're both better off, even though none of us gets goes off with all the goods, is a better way to think about it. And I think that's how the Athenians began to think about politics. They recognized we're in this together. Now, this is a common enterprise. And if we're going to keep security and welfare, we've got to figure out ways to basically cut deals, make a policy on the basis, and then do it again tomorrow.
What's interesting about democracy in Athens, particularly in the mid-5th century BCE, under leaders like Pericles, is it was very democratic within the city-state. But outside the city-state, the rules didn't seem to apply, did they? It was democracy for us, and then, Athenian Empire for sort of everyone else, because during the Persian Wars, Athens' new naval fleet kind of led Greece to a lot of victories, and they were able to chase the Persians out of Greece and a little bit even further east. And then in order to safeguard, the islands of Greece and the mainland of Greece, Athens began the Delian League, which is named after the island of Delos, and being like, all right, everyone contributes either ships to our collective Greek navy, or you give us money. And you don't get a choice. You have to do this. I don't care if you're poor or don't really want to be part of this alliance. You have to be a part of this. And anyone who rebelled against this idea or bridled, like the island of Naxos, were duly punished in extremely harsh ways. And when Sparta was alarmed by the rising naval power of Athens, which eventually culminates in the Peloponnesian Wars of the mid to late 5th century BCE, they clashed several times, and Athens is pretty brutal. So I'm curious to know, and this goes for modern democracies today, the idea of we're free here, but people outside of our immediate area, we kind of rule over. How does the economy work with democracies? And we can sort of, hopefully break that down, because it is confusing.
It is. No, I think that's exactly right. And we tend to associate democracy, I think entirely rightly, with the core values of freedom and equality. And yet we see Athens, once it's led Greece to this victory in the Persian Wars, basically denying freedom and equality outside their own nation. So how do we explain that? I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that democracy, if it's done right, is really a power augmenter. That instead of a community being basically divided against itself, and the rich versus the poor, the urban versus the rural, the aristocrats versus the ordinary people, and everybody having to spend a lot of energy basically in conflict with the other people within your territory, and one group getting domination over the others and spending a lot of energy keeping the others down, whether it's the rich win, then it's an oligarchy, you have to keep down the poor, and so on. In a democracy, what you have when it works is that we're all working towards a common end, and you get all of that social energy coming together and focused on a common enterprise. You also get the capacity to bring together all these different skills and all these different forms of knowledge, all these forms of information and experience can all be brought to the same place. So instead of one tyrant or a small group of people with a limited experience saying, well, what we know about the world is this, and therefore we'll make policy accordingly. You potentially have this vast trove of experience and knowledge that can all be brought to some common enterprise. So, you both get rid of a lot of the friction, social friction that reduces the power of the state. And you also bring in all of this expertise, knowledge, experience that can be used to then do new things like build an effective Navy that's much better than everybody else's Navy. What are you going to do with all that power? Well, you see, that's the thing that democracy doesn't tell you. Democracy tells you, among us, we the Athenians, we the citizens, we'll treat each other as equals, we'll maintain individual and freedom and the freedom of our state. It doesn't tell you that it would be a great idea to extend those ideals externally. And so the Athenians think democracy is great for us, and we'll do the thing that any powerful state does when it gets enough power. Will impose our will on other people. It's a whole next step, really, to then think, well, actually, democracy at home relates somehow to a treatment of people abroad in a different way. And, in the end, the Athenians begin to get this, but it takes the defeat in this great Peloponnesian War that you mentioned before the Athenians really recognized that, maybe this idea of democracy abroad and beating everybody else up because we have so much power, we're so good at this stuff, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Because in the end, it turns out the Athenians didn't have enough power to simply impose their will on the whole of the rest of the Greek world. The other Greek states were disgruntled enough to, in the end, overthrow Athenian imperial hegemony.
Yeah, it does seem to be a common theme where eventually, these imperialistic states do eventually, there's a rebellion against them. But the one thing I want to talk about is, the end of the Peloponnesian War happens. Sparta barely wins the Peloponnesian War. The two sides have been beating each other up for decades. And then Sparta kind of manages to do very briefly what King Cleomenes of Sparta couldn't quite pull off a century before, is install an oligarchy in Athens. That doesn't go well. The Athenians kick them out almost immediately, and they eventually go back to a democracy. But let's talk about the thing that sort of brought down the democracy, which wasn't necessarily an internal threat so much as the external threat of Philip of Macedon hits the scene in the 4th century BCE, along with his famous son Alexander, known as Alexander the Great. And I kind of wanted to talk about the end of democracy in ancient Greece and how the concept managed to survive 2,500 years later, because between the time that Alexander sort of crushes a rebellion where the Athenians try to throw off the Macedonian hegemony, and today, Greece doesn't really have a democracy for a very long time. So I was hoping we could sort of talk about the end of democracy and the revival of democracy. And just because your book is all about, how does it survive? And it's fascinating stuff. And I know my audience wants to know.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things, that you mentioned exactly rightly is that when Athens loses the Peloponnesian War, 404 BCE, the Spartans are victorious, and they impose, an oligarchy on Athens. And I think many people thought that's it. The democracy had failed. We lost security. We lost the war, and maybe it's just all over. Maybe that was just a bad idea. But dramatically, it wasn't just all over. The Athenian Democrats refused to accept that they were going to simply be run by an oligarchy now, and they fought back, and they fought back successfully, pushed out the Spartans, reestablished their democracy, did so on a somewhat different basis. They recognized that they had really ignored rule of law in problematic ways. And so they became much more attached to the idea that yes, we have to have a law-based democracy. And their foreign policy, we have to actually create alliances that are at least closer to equal rather than simply dominating other people. So, democracy has this great second act. We have the what's sometimes called the golden age of the 5th century BCE with Pericles and Themistocles, as you said. And then there's a great second act in the 4th century. And in many ways, that's the period that brings us some of the most important aspects of Greek culture. That's the age of Plato and Aristotle establishing their schools in Athens. Now, they're not big fans of democracy. They don't love democracy, but boy, they don't want to make their school, they don't set up their schools in Sparta. They rather enjoy the kind of freedom that the democracy does afford intellectuals. Freedom to criticize, which becomes then part of the culture of democracy, is that we're not going to kill all the philosophers. There's the famous trial of Socrates. Socrates is executed, and that's a whole other story. But his students continue to really write very challenging things and speak about the problems of democracy, and there's no witch hunt against critical intellectuals for the rest of Athenian history. But you're quite right that in the end, Athens is not able to deal with the challenge of this sort of new form of political organization and social organization that happens in Macedon under the leadership of King Philip II. And why aren't they? I mean, how come they could deal with the Persians and they couldn't deal with Philip? I mean, that's one of the interesting questions to ask here. And I think part of the answer is that Philip was a really smart ruler, and he recognized that if he's going to beat democratic states like Athens, there are other democracies in Greece at this time, he's going to have to borrow from them. And there are all of these really cool innovations that are being developed, not only in military forms of military organization happening in Athens and in another Greek state, Thebes, but also financial reform. So Athens becomes really a center of new forms of thinking about government finance. We don't think about this, don't think that democracy and, innovation in government finance necessarily go together, but they did. And Philip said, oh, this is so great. There's all of these innovations. And look, there are all of these experts who are becoming, highly skilled in these areas. I can hire them myself. I can buy them. It's so cool. This expertise lives in people's heads, and I can buy the heads. And this is what he does. And so in part, it's because he recognizes that there are all of these really terrific, things that he can use. Oh, military organization, state finance. I can put that together with creating a new kind of, sort of national empire based on the idea of Macedonianness. I can do what the Persians couldn't do then, is finally overwhelm the city-states of southern Greece. But it's and so that ultimately is what puts an end to really the second act of Athenian democracy. The Athenians revolt against Alexander, and then against really against his generals, and it doesn't work. And then the Macedonians say, that's enough. You're going to have an oligarchy, and we're going to enforce that. It is important, however, to see that elsewhere in the wider Greek world, especially in what is now Western Turkey, which was rich with Greek city-states, and some of them newly founded by the Macedonians, democracy continues. So that even while it's being suppressed in mainland Greece, the Greek city-states of Anatolia, which were, ostensibly under the control of one of the kings that emerged after, the death of Alexander, the Macedonian kings. Still in all, the kings had to give a lot of local governance independence because they couldn't afford to use the military, capacity that they had to suppress endless revolts by well-fortified and well-defended cities. So we actually have sort of a continuation of the idea of democracy, even after the end of democracy in Athens, that gets built into the way that the Greek heritage is taken up by the Romans, sort of codified by Greek writers, Latin writers in the period of the Roman Empire, and ultimately then is available after the long Middle Ages, in the period of the Renaissance, to be revived, to be rediscovered, and then to become part of the intellectual apparatus of the European and American Enlightenment. And then we're at the 18th century and the American Revolution, which is, in many ways inspired by both the failure of, but also the possibility of ancient forms of democracy and republicanism.
Right. And that brings us back to the present, where we have these democracies. They're definitely not perfect. I mean, you can definitely argue that the founding fathers were a bit hypocritical in some ways, freedom, except for you, and you. And then you have, democracies around the world that, some are a parliamentary system, right? Like they're sort of different takes on democracy. And yet to fast forward to today, sort of bring it full circle, it feels like everything is a little bit on fire, right? Like it feels like democracy should be able to get through this, but we now live in the digital age where things like misinformation and AI and gaslighting and all these things are easier to spread because you do have social media, because you have 24-hour news, because of all this stuff. And it feels like there's a lot of performative actions being taken where no one's really working together. They're just yelling at each other. And it's a little scary. It's working. It's getting people votes. And there doesn't seem to be a consensus. So we're constantly in gridlock. And so it sort of brings us back to the question of, is Western democracy in danger? And if so, how can we course correct this by looking at what the ancient Greeks did right and how other democracies, managed to survive 2,500 plus years? Like what can we do to fix this?
Yeah, I think that at the core of what we have to do is return to, basically fundamentals, and say, all right, what's our alternative? Well, our alternative to democracy is having a boss, basically having somebody who is your ruler, who has final and ultimate authority over you. And that's a pretty rough thing to think about. I mean, I think in some ways we become so used to life in a democracy that we fail to think about the alternatives. You don't have to look too far around the world to recognize that the alternatives can be pretty grim. Right. So if we say that democracy is no boss, or that is only ourselves as bosses, then what do we have to do to keep that boot off our neck? Basically, to not have that boss. And at the core of it, we've got to remember that we're going to have to find ways to make bargains with one another. And bargains are always imperfect from the point of view of, getting everything that I want, or you getting everything that you want, or anybody. So yeah, go back to the American founding. Think about what happens in the with the founders, the creation of the American Constitution. It's a bargain, very imperfect bargain. And they knew it was an imperfect bargain. And we can think of it as hypocritical in one sense, but it's also simply a matter of it was the best bargain that was available. That without making the compromises that we can now look back and say, oh, that was awful, a compromise with slavery, which was recognized at the time as awful. But there wasn't going to be a United States of America that was viable, that had security and welfare, unless a bargain was struck. And that was the best bargain that could be struck, because the various southern states were simply not going to stay in the Union without the survival of, or at least the potential survival of slavery at that point. Oh yeah, because it's a terrible bargain, but it was a necessary bargain to go on and have the possibility of a future. I think that's really the hard nut we have to bite down on, is that yes, there are lots of people that probably, wherever you stand on the political spectrum, you think, I don't want to deal with them. I don't like them. Well, they're awful people. They want awful things. And people on the left and right are increasingly saying, yeah, I refuse to have anything to do with them. But without the capacity to negotiate with one another and to find a compromise that will allow us to go on without a boss, we are in real trouble. And that's, really, I think, a hard lesson to take on board, because we all want justice. We all want, however we define that. We all want a moral community, however we define that. But we're not going to get everything that we want and still not have a boss. And that's I think the hard lesson we have to get through our heads.
Right. So, you may not like everything the other person says, but if you can come together and find some sort of consensus, some sort of middle ground, there's a chance that democracy may survive.
I think there is. I mean, we've had some very rough times in the United States. The Athenians had very rough times. I mean, you think about how difficult Athenian history really was, and yet democracy was revived in the end. There was the threat of Philip, and there are external threats potentially to the democracies of the world today. But the long run story was, in fact, that democracy can survive for a very long time if people can find ways to, yes, find compromise, to say we're not going to have consensus on everything, but we have to have enough agreement on some core commitments, and commitment to what does it take for us to maintain our security? What does it core commitments to maintain some sort of basic prosperity and prosperity for everybody? That's what we have to figure out. And I think that, in the end, how are we going to get there? Well, we need to think seriously about, what I call just civic education, the education of citizens. And, some of that can happen in schools, some of that can happen in universities, but it's going to happen in the culture as well. And I think that's where it comes back to the world of games, because you can learn a lot by playing games, good things and bad things. But I think that at least the potential for learning that there are modes of cooperation that can achieve ends that you are aiming at is at least one thing that's is possible to learn. I don't know, maybe, or am I wrong about this? I mean, you know so much more of, I may know a little bit more about Greek history, although you know a lot, Meg, but you know a lot more about games than I do. Do you think that it's that there's a role for gaming? Not only learning how to win, but also learning how to cooperate with others in order to gain a goal.
I think you said it perfectly that there are games you can play as a solo player, but the best games and the easiest way to win a game is to cooperate with other people, which is why multiplayer games are so fun and so popular, is you're working together to achieve a common goal. And everyone has their role to play. And sometimes someone is going to be left, left, left. You might want to go right, but you have to trust the person. We're going left. We're going to do this. And, just working together to achieve that goal feels really good because it always has, you get better and bigger rewards when you work together. So I think you're absolutely right. Games can reflect real life and real life can reflect games. And in essence, we have to work together to achieve a common goal. And when we do, we can win the game of life. And on that note, I actually wanted to make a bargain with you. I would love to have you on in a future episode of History and Games to talk more about democracy, more about the ancient world and its importance to our present. Because I always say that history is a roadmap. It tells you where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. And I would love to know where we're going on this crazy drive called life.
I would love that, Meg. We haven't even got to talk a little bit about the Romans, and they have a whole story that I think is also very relevant to exactly all the things we've been talking about. So let's talk again sometime soon.
Yes, I actually do have a few. I didn't get a chance to make time for the Romans, although I actually had them in my notes because they too had a sort of a parallel track when it comes to democracy and how that affected the founding fathers as well. And there's at least 3 or 4 games I can think of right off the top of my head where we can definitely talk about the Romans and their ideas of democracy. Always very interesting. It was so great talking to you today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
A great pleasure for me, Meg. I enjoy being able to talk about things I know about, but I learn from others. That's also part of the game of life. And I look forward to learning more from you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for being on today.